I was 30 years old the morning Boston wore its gray like a heavy coat, and the ground at St. Dunstan's Cemetery drank rain as if it had all the time in the world, the brass corners of my grandfather's casket, dull beneath an ocean of black umbrellas, my hand wrapped around the last watch he ever adjusted on my wrist. The incense from the service still clung to my coat, while voices softened to murmurs, and in the lull I could hear the patient machinery of the backhoe waiting by the oaks. Across the grave, my legal father Lawrence shook hands as if the day were a ribbon cutting, his polished smile moving from face to face, while my younger brother Caleb held his coat like a prince trying it on for size. I stayed where I was near enough to see the neat line of earth and the rain gathering in the lilies, remembering the blueprints Samuel and I used to spread across his kitchen table, and the way he'd tap a pencil on the corner and say, "We build what lasts." The prayer ended, umbrellas snapped closed, and the sky finally let loose a steady sheet that chased the crowd to their cars. I didn't move. I waited for the machine to lift the first scoop of soil, waited until the lilies were spotted and heavy, and only then did I breathe. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had to stand steady when someone tried to write you out of your own life. My name is Avery Morgan, and for most of my childhood, the loudest sounds in our house were not arguments, but the quiet scratch of my grandfather's pencil and the steady rhythm of his boots crossing a concrete floor. Samuel built Morgan & Sons from a rented shed and a borrowed truck, and he carried the company through winters that bent steel and summers that baked the skin right off your knuckles. He kept a ledger like scripture and balanced it with the same care he used to level a beam. He raised me on coffee that was always too strong and talks about bids and crews and the pride in signing your name under work you could point to years later. And he made me believe that decency and detail were the only tools you never let anyone take from you. At home, the values were different. Lawrence believed a room was something you entered only after everyone knew you'd arrived, that a contract was a game if you could afford the lawyer, that the press photo was the work, and the work was an afterthought. My mother, Mary Ann, kept a soft house and an easy laugh, but I learned early that her laughter dimmed when Lawrence wanted the air to himself, and she'd smooth her skirt instead of replying. The first time Samuel walked me through a job site, I was 9 and wearing a white sweater that didn't survive the day. I dragged my hand along a cinder block and left a streak that never came out, and he ruffled my hair and said that meant I was getting the right education. He put me in the field every summer after high school, ordering materials, checking punch lists, calling plumbers when the second-floor lines refused to cooperate. And in college, I learned to read budgets the way other people learn to read faces. It was a language he and I shared. By the time I turned 27, I was running 2 mid-rise projects by the harbor, and Samuel let me present updates to the board with him, seated 2 chairs down, quiet, observant leaving space that felt like trust. In that same room, Lawrence treated the conference table like a stage and me like a minor character whose lines could be cut. When he did acknowledge me, it was with a small smile that didn't reach his eyes and a suggestion that I sit in on something more suited to your strengths, which always meant note-taking while Caleb tried on a title and a suit he hadn't earned. There were years when I told myself it would balance out, that if I kept the bids clean, kept the crews paid on time, kept the permits tidy, and the inspectors respected the work, would speak louder than anyone else's ambition. But at dinners in Back Bay, where the napkins felt like linen sheets and the silverware had more pieces than courses, I watched Caleb learn how to talk about projects he'd never walked, and how to laugh at jokes that lasted just long enough for a camera to catch them. The distance between where Samuel taught me to stand and where Lawrence wanted me to sit got wider, not mile by mile but inch by inch, the kind of drift you don't notice until the gap is a chasm. I kept showing up before dawn, steel-toed boots in my trunk and a pair of heels in the back seat, for later believing the work could still build a bridge. When the pneumonia set in that last February, Samuel's voice grew thin but never unsteady, and he asked me to bring him the field photos on my phone so he could zoom in and check the flashing along a parapet wall. He didn't talk about wills or shares, just about the weight a name should carry and the kind of promise you make to people whose mortgages depend on the next Friday's check. He held my wrist and adjusted the watch band one last time, and the only thing he asked was that I keep my name as clean as his. I thought we had time to sit with an attorney and a pen, but the hospital monitors ran their race, and the race ran out. After the funeral, I returned to my apartment with my coat still damp at the hem and a vase of lilies that made the room smell like a memory I didn't want. And I opened my laptop and scrolled through photos of his hands, measuring a run of stair treads, the pencil behind his ear, the smudge of sawdust on his sleeve. 2 days later, a summons arrived from Arthur Keene's office, the gold lettering on the envelope neat and certain, inviting the family to a formal reading at 5 o'clock sharp. Lawrence forwarded the email to me with a line that read, "Be punctual," and to Caleb with a thumbs-up emoji that said more than words. I stood at my kitchen counter with my car keys under my palm and watched the afternoon light crawl down the wall, and for the first time since we lowered Samuel into the ground, I felt the floor shift under me. I knew how to brace a wall and how to square a frame. I didn't yet know how to brace for the moment a room can change the shape of a life. When I walked into Arthur's paneled conference room and saw the seats already claimed and the smiles already practiced, I took the last chair by the window and counted my breaths while the rain started again over Boston. Arthur straightened his papers, cleared his throat, and the room went very still. Arthur cleared his throat, and the sound of papers sliding across the polished table seemed louder than the rain outside. The room was heavy with that particular stillness that comes before bad news, the kind of quiet that feels rehearsed. My mother sat near the corner, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while my father leaned back in his chair, as if he already knew what would be said. Caleb twirled a pen between his fingers, a small smile tugging at the edge of his mouth. I tried to steady my breathing, but the pulse in my throat refused to calm. Arthur's voice was even deliberate, every word pronounced like it had been written twice. "I regret to inform you that Mr. Samuel Morgan passed without leaving a will." He paused, letting the words settle. "Under Massachusetts law, the estate will transfer to his next of kin, his son Lawrence Pike." I felt the sentence hit me before I understood it. There was a faint echo of shuffling chairs, someone's sigh, and then silence again. Lawrence's smirk was almost imperceptible, but it found me anyway. He folded his hands, pretending restraint. "Well," he said almost pleasantly, "that simplifies things." He turned slightly toward me, his tone polite but sharp enough to cut glass. "Avery, you won't have to concern yourself with the company any longer. Caleb will take on responsibility when the time's right." Caleb's grin widened, confident and shallow. "Guess I'll have to start getting fitted for suits that actually matter," he said, and the board members laughed softly just enough to sting. The humiliation burned through me before the shock could. I wanted to speak to remind them how many late nights I'd spent in that very office, drafting proposals and fixing budgets, how many project delays I'd personally resolved without asking for credit. But my father's gaze pinned me where I sat, steady, cold, absolute. "You've done your part," he said smoothly, as if he were discussing a contract that had reached its term. "It's time to let the men handle the future." I stared at the grain in the table, tracing the faint lines that ran across its surface. For years, this company had been my anchor, the one thing that still connected me to the man who taught me what integrity meant. Now that anchor was gone. Arthur looked toward me, sympathy flickering in his eyes, but he said nothing. The meeting ended with a few polite goodbyes and the soft thud of briefcases closing. My father rose, straightened his jacket, and gestured for Caleb to follow. As they walked out, I stayed seated, watching the rain blur the lights outside until they were just streaks against the glass. That evening, Boston's streets glowed under wet pavement and neon signs. I walked without direction, the city around me alive with noise, while I felt hollowed out inside. Every storefront reflection showed a version of myself I didn't recognize, someone small, someone forgotten. By the time I reached my apartment, my shoes were soaked and my hair stuck to my face, but I barely noticed. I dropped my bag on the counter and sat down in the dark. For a long time, I just listened to the sound of the radiator ticking and the rain against the windows. The next morning, I drove to the Morgan & Sons headquarters out of habit, not purpose. The building smelled faintly of dust and pine cleaner, the same as it always had, but the warmth was gone. People looked away when I passed. Some nodded quickly, their smiles uncertain, others avoided eye contact entirely. It was as if my father's words from the day before had already become company policy. I stepped into my office to find the desk cleared except for a folded notice. Effective immediately, your position has been dissolved. My nameplate was missing. My keycard didn't work. Down the hall, my father's voice carried through the open boardroom doors. This is a new chapter, he was saying. My son Caleb will be shadowing me from here on. Let's all welcome the next generation. A polite chorus followed applause without feeling. I stood for a moment at the threshold, watching the back of his head, the tailored suit, the practiced nods of agreement around him. Then I turned and walked away before anyone could notice me. That night I couldn't sleep. My apartment felt smaller than usual, as if the walls were moving closer. I opened the drawer where I kept the few things that still connected me to Samuel, the watch, a folded blueprint from our last project together, and an old photo of us standing in front of the harbor site. He had his arm around me, both of us covered in dust, and smiling like we'd built the whole world with our own hands. I ran my fingers over the image until the edges curled. 3 days passed like that, long hours, short meals, no peace. On the third night, just after midnight, a knock startled me. The sound was soft, but insistent. I hesitated before opening the door. My mother stood there in the hallway, rain clinging to her coat, her hair damp against her forehead. She looked smaller than I remembered, her eyes red, her fingers trembling around her purse strap. "Mom." My voice came out low, uncertain. She stepped inside, quickly glancing down the hall, as though someone might be watching. "I couldn't stay quiet any longer," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's gone too far this time." She reached into her purse and pulled out a sealed envelope. "Your grandfather gave me this years ago," she said, pressing it into my hands. The paper felt thick, the seal unbroken, the weight heavier than its size. "What is it?" I asked. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment the fear in them eased into something else, resolve. "Proof," she said. "It's time they learn who you really are." I stared at the envelope, at the neat wax seal glistening under my kitchen light. "What does that mean?" I whispered. My mother's hands were shaking, but her voice steadied. "Lawrence made you believe you had no power. But Samuel, he made sure you did. Before he passed, he asked me to keep this safe for you." I sat down slowly, the envelope still in my hands, the room suddenly too quiet. "You knew?" I asked. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I knew enough," she said, "and I stayed quiet, because I was afraid of what he'd do if anyone found out. But when I saw him take everything from you, when I saw that look in his eyes, I couldn't stay silent anymore." The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual. I could feel the beat of my pulse in my fingertips. My mother placed her hands on my shoulders, her grip firm, her voice low but certain. "Inside that envelope are papers Samuel gave me. Keep them safe. When the time comes, you'll know what to do." She left soon after, her figure disappearing down the rain-slick street, her umbrella flipping backward in the wind before she caught it. I locked the door behind her and sat at the table with the envelope in front of me. The wax seal caught the light from the lamp, a small red gleam that pulsed like a heartbeat. I didn't open it that night. I walked circles around the kitchen making tea. I didn't drink, checking the lock again, replaying every word she'd said. "It's time they learn who you really are." I didn't know whether that meant something to fear or something to finally claim. But for the first time in weeks, I felt something that wasn't anger or grief. It was smaller, quieter hope, fragile as a match in a storm. By morning, the rain had stopped. The city outside my window looked scrubbed clean, though nothing about my life felt that way. The envelope sat waiting on the table. I poured a cup of coffee, sat down, and ran my finger over the seal one last time. Then I broke it. Inside was a single letter written in my grandfather's handwriting, steady, confident, unmistakable, and behind it, several folded documents. My breath caught before I'd read a word. That was the moment everything I thought I knew about my family began to shift. I didn't yet understand how much power those pages held or how dangerous they would make me, but I could feel it. The change had already started. The paper trembled in my hands as I unfolded the letter, the familiar shape of my grandfather's handwriting bringing back every Sunday morning we'd spent at his kitchen table. His penmanship was still sharp, every curve deliberate. "Avery," it began, "if you are reading this, it means my time has ended. I never trusted Lawrence to honor my wishes. You are my true heir, the one who carries my name in spirit, not just in blood. Never forget who you are." The words blurred for a moment before I blinked the tears away. I turned to the documents behind it, a notarized letter bearing Samuel's signature, a legal acknowledgement naming me as his rightful heir, and then a birth record I'd never seen before. Under Father, the line was blank, but below it, stamped and signed years later, was Samuel's own declaration recognizing me as his heir by bloodline acknowledgement. I stared until the letters lost shape, until the truth settled in one slow, breathtaking wave. Lawrence wasn't my father. He had known it all along. I sat frozen at my kitchen table, the letter open beside my coffee cup, the clock ticking in the background. Pieces of memory began to align his indifference, the way he had always looked through me, rather than at me, the strange distance that no amount of achievement could close. For years I had assumed it was disappointment. Now I saw it for what it was, contempt built on fear. Samuel had chosen me, and Lawrence had spent decades pretending otherwise. By the time the sun rose over the Charles, the envelope's contents were neatly stacked in front of me. My hands were still shaking when I called my mother. She answered on the first ring. "You read it," she said softly. I could hear the tremor in her voice. "I did. I managed. It's true, isn't it?" There was silence, then a quiet sigh that sounded like surrender. Every word she whispered. "Samuel wanted to make sure you could never be erased. He told me one day you'd understand why he was so protective of you." The following Sunday, Lawrence hosted a family gathering at the estate, what he called a celebration of continuity. The invitations had gone out before Samuel was even laid to rest. I almost stayed home, but something inside me refused. I placed the envelope carefully in my bag and drove through the long line of maples leading to the house. From the outside, it looked exactly as it always had: trimmed hedges, spotless stone glass that caught the morning light. But the air inside felt wrong, polished and cold. The parlor buzzed with low conversation. Board members and distant relatives mingled glasses of wine and hand voices, just loud enough to sound important. Lawrence stood near the fireplace in a navy suit, the perfect host, while Caleb drifted nearby accepting congratulations, like a man already rehearsing power. I could hear snippets of talk, Vice President future, of the company legacy words that used to comfort me but now felt hollow. When I walked in, the room fell quiet for half a beat. Then the noise resumed, just a little louder, as if to cover the shift. Lawrence spotted me and smiled tightly. "Avery," he said, his tone smooth. "Didn't think you'd make it." "Neither did I said, matching his stare. He raised his glass. "We're here to honor new beginnings," he announced to the room. "Caleb will be stepping into his role as Vice President of Morgan & Sons." Applause followed, quick and obedient. Caleb straightened the grin he wore, meant to look humble, but landing somewhere closer to smug. I waited until the clapping subsided. "Before you hand out titles," I said, stepping forward, "there's something everyone here deserves to know." My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Lawrence's expression froze. This isn't the time he warned. It's exactly the time I said. I pulled the envelope from my bag and placed it on the table beside the champagne glasses. Samuel didn't die without a will. He left these for me. The room stilled. I broke the seal once more and unfolded the letter, reading aloud. My voice filled the space, echoing against marble and glass. "Avery is my rightful heir, the only one I trust to carry this company forward with integrity." I looked up. Every pair of eyes was on me. "He didn't trust you, Lawrence," I said quietly. "He knew what you'd do." Lawrence's composure cracked for the first time. "Sit down," he snapped. "You're embarrassing yourself." "No," another voice said. My mother rose from her chair, her face pale but resolute. "She's telling the truth." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Lawrence turned on her, his jaw tight. "Marianne," he hissed. "Not here." But she didn't back down. Samuel gave me those papers because he knew you'd try to destroy them. He wanted Avery to inherit, not you or Caleb. The sound that followed wasn't applause or argument. It was the collective murmur of realization. Board members exchanged glances. A few quietly stepped away from Lawrence's side. Caleb's smirk faltered. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice rising. "You can't just read some letter and think you've been living off his lies for years," I said evenly. "Maybe it's time you learned the truth, too." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Lawrence's voice dropped to a low, dangerous whisper. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "Yes," I said, meeting his eyes. "I've reminded everyone who built this family's name." My mother's hand found mine, her grip firm. Around us, the party had dissolved into scattered conversations, some hushed, some frantic. The board's general counsel, a gray-haired man I barely knew, cleared his throat. "We'll need to review those documents," he said. "If they're legitimate, this changes everything." Lawrence's face went red, then pale. "Don't you dare entertain this nonsense," he barked. "This company is mine by law." I folded the papers carefully and slipped them back into the envelope. "Then you shouldn't be afraid of the truth," I said. By the time I reached the door, the room had turned into a storm of whispers. My mother followed me out onto the porch. The air was sharp cold against my cheeks. "You know what he's capable of," she said quietly. "You can't face him alone." I looked at her, the light from the house flickering across her face. "I don't plan to," I told her. Grandpa didn't trust him for a reason. Now it's time to find someone who can prove what he did. The next morning, I met with a lawyer I'd once met through a local business forum, Derek Lawson. He was younger than most, sharp-eyed and direct, with a reputation for uncovering the kind of truths people paid to bury. We sat in a quiet corner of a coffee shop near Beacon Hill. I handed him the envelope and explained everything. He read each page in silence, his brow furrowing deeper as he went. When he finally looked up, his expression was thoughtful, but guarded. "These are strong," he said. "But if your father's as connected as you describe, we'll need more than letters. We'll need evidence proof that the original will existed and that it was hidden or destroyed." "How do we find that?" I asked. He leaned back, considering. "Old employees, paper trails, anything that went missing when your grandfather passed. If there's a cover-up, someone knows." When I left the cafe, the sky had darkened again, the kind of heavy gray that hangs low over the city. I felt that same weight pressing down, but this time it didn't crush me. It steadied me. For years I had carried my grandfather's lessons like they were memories. Now they were a mission. That night I stored the envelope in a fireproof box beneath my bed and double-checked the locks on my door. Through the quiet hum of the city, I could almost hear Samuel's voice, steady, patient, the same way he'd spoken to me on that last hospital visit. "They can't take your honor unless you hand it over." I wasn't planning to hand over anything. Not my name, not his legacy, and certainly not the truth. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the river, low and distant, like a promise that the real storm hadn't even begun. Derek wasted no time after our first meeting. Within days, he began digging through the archives, tracing the paper trail that had gone quiet right after Samuel's death. I spent my evenings sorting through old folders and files, hunting for anything that might connect Lawrence to the missing will. Most nights, the only sound in my apartment was the hum of the desk lamp and the whisper of papers sliding across the table. Each document felt like a breadcrumb leading back to a truth that had been deliberately buried. A week later, Derek called to say he'd found someone willing to talk. Her name was Lydia Hart, a former secretary at the law office that once handled Samuel's estate. "She's nervous," Derek warned, "but she remembers more than she lets on." We met her at a small diner off Tremont Street. Lydia was in her early 60s, her hands steady, but her voice careful. She stirred her coffee without drinking it, eyes darting to the window as though she feared someone might be watching. "I saw a will," she said quietly. "Mr. Morgan signed it himself. It was in Mr. Keene's safe the last time I checked." She hesitated before adding, then Mr. Pike came to the office. The next day, the safe was empty. The words sat between us, heavy and certain. Derek asked for dates, names, anything she could recall, and Lydia gave what she remembered enough to confirm what we already suspected. When we left the diner, the late afternoon light had turned golden, but it felt cold on my skin. Derek turned to me as we walked toward his car. "This is the first real crack in the wall," he said. "If we can prove Pierce and your father removed that will, we'll have enough to take it to court." That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. A dark sedan had been idling near my apartment earlier in the week, and now it was there again, parked across the street, engine running, windows tinted too dark to see inside. I pulled the curtains shut and locked the door, forcing myself to breathe evenly. When I returned to the table, a piece of paper had been slipped under the door. 4 words scrawled in black ink: "Stop before it's too late." My hand shook as I picked it up. I called Derek immediately. His tone hardened. "This means we're close," he said. "Don't stay there alone tonight. Pack a bag and go to your mother's." I did as he said. The night air felt colder than usual as I stepped outside. I could still feel the eyes from that car, even as I pulled onto the main road. At my mother's house, she met me at the door in her robe, worry creasing her face. "You're not safe with him angry," she whispered, ushering me inside. The clock on the mantel ticked softly while she made tea. Neither of us drank. The following morning, Derek filed for a protective injunction and began preparing the case. Over the next few days, everything moved fast: subpoenas, statements, motions to unseal Samuel's financial records. Lawrence's lawyers responded just as quickly, filling the docket with delays and denials. Each letter they filed was another attempt to make me doubt myself. But every time I started to question if I was strong enough to keep going, I'd hear Samuel's voice in my head. "They can't take your honor unless you give it away." When the court date finally arrived, the hearing room smelled faintly of varnish and dust, the kind of scent that clings to old justice. The rows of benches were nearly full employees from the company family members, even a few reporters drawn by the name Morgan. I sat beside Derek, hands folded in my lap, the envelope resting on the table in front of us like a quiet heartbeat. Across the aisle, Lawrence appeared calm, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his expression carved from stone. Caleb sat behind him, pale and uneasy. Their attorney, Mr. Shaw, whispered something to Lawrence, who nodded once without looking my way. The judge, Naomi Ellis, entered with a measured step, her robe trailing like a dark wave. "This court will now hear the matter of the estate of Samuel Morgan," she said. Her voice carried the kind of authority that didn't need to rise. Derek began with a simple statement. "Your Honor, we believe the deceased's true will was deliberately concealed by Lawrence Pike, aided by his counsel at the time, Mr. Arthur Keene. He presented the envelope, each page sealed in transparent sleeves. Contained within are the original documents accompanied by sworn testimony confirming the will's existence." Judge Ellis glanced through the papers, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Proceed," she said. Derek called me to the stand first. The oath felt heavy on my tongue, but when I began speaking, the words came steady. I told the court about the letter about my mother's late-night visit, about the document Samuel had left behind. I described the day at the estate when I confronted my father and read the letter aloud. My voice didn't shake until I said, "He wanted to erase me." The judge listened without expression, but I saw something soften in her eyes. Then Derek called Lydia. She walked to the stand, shoulders drawn tight, clutching her purse as if it could protect her. When she spoke, her tone was quiet but sure. "I saw Mr. Morgan sign his will," she said. "It was locked in the office safe. The next day after Mr. Pike's visit, it was gone." A murmur ran through the room. Lawrence shifted in his seat, his composure cracking for the first time. "That's a lie," he said sharply. The judge silenced him with a glance. "You'll have your turn, Mr. Pike." When his turn came, he rose slowly, his movements rehearsed. "This is absurd," he declared. "Avery is mistaken. My father left no such will. She's confused and emotional. She's always been impressionable." I met his gaze without blinking. "Impressionable enough to build your company's projects from the ground up?" I asked. The judge raised a hand, signaling me to stop, but I saw the flicker of embarrassment cross his face. Derek handed the court clerk a series of documents, financial transfers traced to Lawrence's account. Large sums paid out within days of Samuel's death. These payments, Derek explained, align with the timeline of the missing will. They appear to have been made to secure silence from those aware of the document's disappearance. Lawrence started to protest, but Judge Ellis cut him off. "Do you deny authorizing these transactions?" He hesitated just long enough for the silence to answer. Then my mother stood from the gallery. "Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling but clear, "I can confirm everything my daughter has said. Samuel gave me that envelope before he died. He feared Lawrence would destroy it." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Lawrence turned on her, his control slipping. "Marianne, sit down," he hissed. She didn't. "You've hidden behind your lies long enough," she said quietly. The judge struck her gavel once. "Order." She looked between us, the weight of the decision visible in her expression. Based on the evidence presented, letters, sworn testimony, and financial discrepancies, this court finds sufficient cause to open a full criminal investigation into the alleged concealment of the will. A murmur spread through the room. The estate of Samuel Morgan will remain frozen until that investigation concludes. I exhaled slowly, barely aware that I'd been holding my breath. The room blurred for a moment as my mother reached for my hand. Across the aisle, Lawrence's attorney whispered frantically, but he looked past him, his eyes fixed on me. "You think you've won," he said under his breath. "This isn't over." I stood meeting his stare. "You're right," I said quietly. "It's only beginning." When the gavel struck again, the sound was final. The court adjourned, the room filled with footsteps and whispers, and I felt the weight of years begin to lift slowly like dawn breaking after a long night. Outside, the air carried a faint chill and the city felt different, brighter somehow. Derek joined me on the courthouse steps. "He'll fight," he said. "But you've got the truth on your side now." I nodded, watching the traffic move along the street. That's all I ever needed. As I walked toward my car, I glanced back once and saw my mother standing by the courthouse doors, her coat pulled tight against the wind. For the first time, she looked free. I didn't know what the next battle would bring, but I knew we weren't fighting alone anymore. The storm my father had built around us was finally breaking apart, and beyond it something steady was waiting to be rebuilt. In the weeks that followed the hearing, the story of our family seemed to spread faster than I could keep up with it. Local papers ran small articles about the investigation into Morgan & Sons, mentioning words like fraud and concealment that made my stomach twist each time I saw them. Lawrence's name appeared in print next to mine for the first time in years, but not as allies opposing sides of a story he no longer controlled. I thought that victory might feel lighter, but the truth carried its own kind of weight. At the office, employees spoke in quiet tones when I walked by. Some nodded with cautious respect. Others looked uncertain, unsure which side history would favor once the dust settled. I didn't blame them. My father had built a culture of fear so strong that people forgot how to speak without permission. The difference now was that his permission didn't matter anymore. Derek stayed close through the first few days, managing the legal details that seemed to multiply by the hour. "They'll fight back," he said, spreading out a new stack of paperwork across my kitchen table. "Expect countersuits, delays, anything to make you quit before the final ruling." I nodded, though part of me was already too tired to argue. "Then we keep going," I said quietly. He gave me a small smile. "That's what I expected you'd say." Caleb called me one evening just as the sun was setting behind the skyline. I let the phone ring twice before answering. His voice was subdued, stripped of the confidence I'd known all my life. "Avery." "I heard about the court's decision," he began, Dad's furious. I leaned against the counter, watching the last streaks of orange fade through the blinds. "That's not news," I said. "He always is." Caleb hesitated, then sighed. "You really think you're the better person to run this company?" The question wasn't cruel. It sounded almost genuine. "No," I said after a pause. "I don't think it's about being better. I think it's about doing what's right." He didn't reply for a while, just breathed softly on the other end of the line. "Be careful," he said at last, then hung up. The next morning, Derek and I met again to prepare for the next phase. The investigation was now in full motion, and subpoenas had been issued for both Lawrence and his longtime lawyer, Arthur Keene. We knew Lawrence would try to spin it as a misunderstanding or a paperwork error, but the financial records told a cleaner story than words ever could. It was only a matter of time. Still, the pressure built. One afternoon, as I left the office, I found a tire on my car slashed clean through. The mechanic said it looked deliberate. A day later, my mother received a call from an unlisted number warning her to tell your daughter to stop. She called me shaken, her voice trembling through the receiver. "He's desperate," she whispered. "Promise me you'll stay somewhere safe." I packed a small bag and moved into a short-term rental closer to downtown, where security cameras faced every street corner. Despite the unease, I refused to stop showing up. I met with the board members still loyal to my grandfather's principles, assuring them that the company's foundation was solid, that the storm would pass. This place was built on more than one man's ego, I told them during a late-night meeting. It was built by people who cared about their work. We're not losing that. A few nodded. Others just listened, wary but hopeful. Hope was enough for me. When the criminal investigation hearing opened in late spring, the courthouse was packed again. Lawrence entered with the same stiff pride as before, though his eyes no longer carried certainty, only exhaustion covered by anger. Arthur followed close behind, pale and rigid, his usual composure gone. Derek leaned toward me as we sat. "They're nervous," he said softly. "That's good." Judge Ellis presided once more, her tone even and steady. "We are here to review findings regarding potential will concealment, document tampering, and financial misconduct." Her gaze moved from Lawrence to me. "Ms. Morgan, your evidence has been reviewed in full. Mr. Pike, you will have the opportunity to respond." Lawrence stood, his voice clipped. "My daughter has fabricated a story to tarnish my name. My father never intended her as heir." He gestured toward me. "She's manipulated my wife, coerced an employee, and distorted old paperwork." The judge raised an eyebrow. "You have proof of this?" Lawrence hesitated, glancing toward Arthur, who looked ready to vanish into the floor. "No direct proof," he admitted, "but I know my family." The words hung in the air, weak, defensive, unconvincing. Then Derek rose. "Your Honor, we submit further financial evidence, transactions routed through a secondary account belonging to Mr. Keene consistent with the timing of the missing will. We also present a statement from an associate of his office confirming that documents were destroyed under his instruction." The courtroom murmured. Lawrence's face drained of color as the judge read through the paperwork. Arthur's hands shook visibly. "Mr. Keene," she said sharply, "do you wish to respond?" Arthur's voice cracked. Your Honor, I was pressured." He swallowed hard. "Mr. Pike ordered me to remove the original will. He said it was to protect the company from division." Lawrence spun toward him in disbelief. "You coward!" he hissed. But it was too late. The confession had broken the wall that had stood for nearly a decade. The judge called for order, striking her gavel once. Given the corroborated testimony, this court refers the matter to the state for prosecution of fraud and concealment. Her eyes softened slightly as she turned to me. "Ms. Morgan, pending resolution, the estate will remain under your temporary management." It took a moment for the words to reach me. Around the room, people shifted, whispering quietly. Lawrence's lawyer placed a hand on his arm, urging him to sit. My mother's eyes glistened from the back row. When I finally stood, it felt as though the ground beneath me had steadied for the first time in years. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited with cameras raised, their voices blending into a blur of questions. I ignored them and walked down the marble steps with my mother beside me. She touched my arm lightly. "You did what your grandfather couldn't," she said softly. "You told the truth out loud." I smiled faintly. He gave me the strength to. That night, I sat by my apartment window, watching the city lights reflect off the river. The air smelled faintly of rain, the kind that carries the promise of renewal instead of ruin. My phone buzzed, once an unknown number. For a moment I thought about ignoring it, but something made me answer. Caleb's voice came through the line, quiet and hesitant. "Avery, he said I saw the news." His words faltered. "Dad's saying he'll never forgive you, but I wanted to tell you something different. You were right." The silence that followed was long but not empty. "He made me believe this company was about power," he said. "You're showing me it's about legacy. If there's a place for me to make things right, I'll take it." I stared out at the water, the lights rippling across its surface. "We'll talk when the time's right," I said gently. "Start by learning the work, not the title." He exhaled shakily. I can do that." When the call ended, I sat for a while listening to the quiet hum of the city. The storm that had defined my life for so long was finally starting to ease. There were still hearings to come, documents to sign, decisions that would change everything about the company's future. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid. In the morning, I'd step back into the office, my office now, and begin the work of rebuilding what had been nearly destroyed by greed. The walls would need repainting, the ledgers rebalanced, the people reminded of who Samuel Morgan truly was. But the foundation was still there, solid as ever. Outside, the dawn crept up over the city, soft and golden against the rooftops. I could almost hear my grandfather's voice again, steady as always, build what lasts. And this time, I intended to. The morning I returned to the company felt like stepping into a house that had been locked for too long. The air was still heavy with what had been left unsaid. The polished floors gleamed under the hallway lights, but the walls seemed to carry echoes of every argument, every silence that had filled this place before. I paused at the entrance, taking in the nameplate by the door, Morgan & Sons Builders, and for the first time the letters didn't feel borrowed. They felt earned. Inside the main conference room, the board had gathered. Familiar faces lined the long table. People who had once been too afraid to look at me now sat upright, waiting. Derek stood near the head of the table, his briefcase open beside him. He nodded when he saw me, offering that small, steady look that had become our shared shorthand for, "We're not done yet, but we're getting there." I took my seat, laid a folder on the table, and began. "I know this has been a difficult few months," I said. My voice carried more easily than I expected. There's been confusion, tension, and uncertainty, but the investigation has reached its conclusion. As of this morning, the court has recognized me as the rightful heir and executive of Morgan & Sons. No one spoke at first. Then one of the senior engineers, a man who had worked here since my grandfather's earliest days, cleared his throat. "Miss Morgan," he said quietly, "your grandfather would be proud." That single sentence broke the stillness like a window opening to fresh air. Others nodded. A few smiled. For the first time since this battle began, I didn't feel like a stranger in my own company. Over the next days, the work began again in earnest. We combed through financial records, replacing the systems that Lawrence had built to serve himself. I met with department heads, restored old contracts my grandfather had once prioritized, and rehired employees who had been dismissed for speaking up. Each action felt like a small piece of restoration. Brick by brick, the foundation was returning to what it was meant to be. One afternoon, while reviewing old project archives, I found an envelope in Samuel's handwriting tucked inside a worn blueprint folder. Inside was a note written years before. "If this company ever loses its heart, give it back its hands." I traced the ink with my thumb, thinking of the crews who had built everything from scratch, the same men and women who now filled the break room again, their laughter beginning to return to the halls. Meanwhile, the legal side of the story moved steadily toward its end. Lawrence and Arthur faced formal charges of fraud and concealment. The news spread quickly. Reporters parked outside the courthouse, their microphones catching every small headline. Derek kept me informed, but shielded me from most of the noise. "You don't need to attend every hearing," he said one evening. The evidence speaks for itself. Still, part of me couldn't stay away. I sat quietly in the back row of the courtroom during the final session. Lawrence stood at the defense table, shoulders drawn tight, the sharpness gone from his face. Arthur looked smaller somehow, pale under the fluorescent lights. The prosecutor outlined the evidence one last time: Lydia's testimony, the forged documents, the diverted payments. Each detail painted a picture of how far my father had gone to protect a lie. When the judge read the verdict, guilty of will, concealment, and fraud, the room felt both silent and impossibly loud at once. Lawrence didn't look at me. He only lowered his head as the gavel struck, sealing what he'd spent a lifetime trying to avoid: accountability. Outside the courthouse, I found my mother waiting near the steps. She wore the same navy coat she'd had for years, her hands folded in front of her. "It's over," she said quietly. I nodded. For him, maybe. For us, it's time to start over. That night, I walked through the nearly empty headquarters after everyone had gone home. The city lights glowed through the tall windows, scattering soft reflections across the framed photos that lined the hallways. Samuel shaking hands with workers' early construction sites, completed towers stretching into clear skies. I stopped at one picture in particular, him and me standing in hard hats beside a half-built foundation, his arm resting on my shoulder. The memory was so vivid I could almost hear his voice again. Build what lasts. The next morning, Caleb came to my office without calling first. He looked nothing like the brother who used to laugh through meetings or boast about titles. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes tired. "You're probably the last person who wants to see me," he said as he stepped inside. I gestured toward the chair across from my desk. "Sit," I said softly. He hesitated, then sat down. "Dad's been sentenced," he said after a moment. "He called me yesterday. I didn't pick up." His voice cracked slightly before he caught himself. "I guess I just wanted to say, you were right." I leaned back, studying him. "Being right doesn't matter as much as what you do now." He nodded, eyes fixed on the floor. "I want to help fix things," he said. "Not from a title or a paycheck. I don't want to be part of the damage anymore." For a moment I saw flashes of the younger brother who used to tag along at job sites pretending to measure beams with a tape too short to reach the end. I finally said, "If you mean that there's a place for you here, but you'll start where everyone else starts. No shortcuts." He looked up, eyes glinting with something like gratitude. "Understood," he said. After he left, I sat for a while listening to the faint hum of the city outside. The anger that had once filled this office seemed to have drained away, replaced by something quieter, resolve maybe, or peace. The next chapter wouldn't be about revenge or reputation. It would be about rebuilding not just the company, but the people connected to it. In the weeks that followed, the transformation began to show. The office reopened with a new team of project leads. I launched an apprenticeship program under Samuel's name for young builders across the state, an idea he'd once sketched on the back of a napkin, but never lived to finish. We called it the Morgan Foundation, and the first class of apprentices started that summer. Seeing their faces light up as they stepped onto their first construction site reminded me why all of this had mattered. One evening, after a long day reviewing plans, I stepped onto the terrace that overlooked the city. The air was warm, filled with the hum of late traffic and the faint scent of concrete after rain. My mother joined me, her arm brushing mine as she leaned on the railing. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said. "He always believed this company had a soul. You gave it back to him." I smiled, my gaze following the skyline. Maybe we both did. Below, lights from the harbor shimmered like gold dust scattered on water. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the steady rhythm of the city, the same one that had carried me through loss, betrayal, and truth. I thought of Samuel's words carved into the cornerstone of the company's first building. "Integrity is the weight that keeps a structure standing." He had built those words into every wall he touched. Now it was my turn to keep them there. As the night settled deeper over Boston, I knew the hardest part was behind us, but the work was far from over. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new blueprints, new expectations. And I would meet them the only way I knew how, brick by brick, with both hands steady, just as he taught me. That fall, the city began to shift around me. The heat softened, leaves curled to amber, and the rhythm of life inside the company finally found its balance again. The chaos had quieted, but the silence it left behind was heavy, filled with unfinished business, and the echo of my grandfather's promise. Each morning when I unlocked the front doors of Morgan & Sons, the lobby lights flickered on like they were taking a deep breath with me. This place was alive again, but its heartbeat felt different. By October, the investigation into my father's misconduct had officially closed. Lawrence accepted a plea deal that spared him prison in exchange for restitution and a lifetime ban from serving on any corporate board. The headlines faded as quickly as they had appeared, replaced by the next scandal somewhere else. But for us, the aftermath was quieter, deeper. My mother moved to a small cottage outside the city, a white clapboard home near the harbor where the air smelled like salt and rain. She started tending a garden she'd once abandoned years ago, saying it helped her remember who she was before fear made her small. Caleb started his apprenticeship under the project management team, showing up every morning with a notebook and a quiet determination that reminded me of the boy who used to follow Samuel around construction sites. The first few weeks, people eyed him warily, unsure if he'd inherited more from our father than just his name. But he didn't complain, didn't cut corners, and never asked for favors. One evening after a long shift, I saw him out on the scaffolding covered in dust, helping a crew finish the last pour of concrete before sunset. When he climbed down, his hands were scraped, but there was a look in his eyes that I hadn't seen in years, something honest, something earned. The company itself began to heal in small, tangible ways. I walked through departments that had once been hushed by fear and saw life-returning people laughing, coffee cups balanced on stacks of plans, music low in the background. Derek stopped by, often helping finalize the foundation's charter and review the last of the estate filings. "You've turned this place around faster than anyone expected," he told me one afternoon as we stood in the boardroom that overlooked the city skyline. I smiled faintly. Maybe it just needed someone to stop shouting long enough to hear it breathe. He chuckled, then closed his briefcase. "Your grandfather would have liked that." I watched him leave sunlight pooling on the polished table and thought about how much of this journey had been about learning when to build and when to stop tearing things down. In November, we held a small ceremony to honor Samuel's legacy and announce the first scholarships from the Morgan Foundation. The auditorium smelled faintly of pine and fresh paint. Rows of students filled the seats, young men and women who had grown up dreaming of building something of their own. As I stood at the podium looking out over their faces, I thought of Samuel's steady voice teaching me how to read blueprints before I could even drive. My grandfather believed that work built with integrity lasts longer than steel, I said. He left behind more than a company, he left us the responsibility to protect it. The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was warm. My mother sat in the front row, her eyes shining, and Caleb stood near the aisle, still in his work boots, clapping until his palms turned red. Later that evening, when the last of the guests had gone, I lingered in the empty hall. The chairs sat neatly in rows, the stage lights dimmed. I placed my hand on the wooden railing and whispered softly, "We did it, Grandpa." For a moment, I almost felt him beside me, the faint scent of sawdust and coffee drifting through the air. A few days later, I visited the old family estate for the first time since everything fell apart. The house felt smaller than I remembered, less grand, more hollow. Boxes lined the walls, filled with the remnants of a life built on appearances. My father's study was empty, except for the old mahogany desk and a single framed photograph of him and Samuel from decades ago. I stood there a long time before I finally picked it up. They looked younger, both smiling in a way that time had erased. I didn't take the picture with me, but I didn't leave angry either. I simply set it back down and closed the door behind me. Outside, the air carried the sharp scent of the sea, the same one that used to fill Samuel's workshop when he'd open the windows wide in summer. I walked across the gravel path toward my car and caught sight of my mother by the front gate waving. "Ready?" she asked. I nodded. "There's nothing here for us anymore." As we drove away, the house receded into the fog until it was just a shadow against the trees. Winter came early that year, and with it a quiet kind of peace. The company had its best quarter in nearly a decade, not because of profit, but because of purpose. We started new projects focused on sustainable materials, housing for veterans, and community spaces in neighborhoods Samuel once dreamed of restoring. The first completed site opened in December, a modest housing complex on the city's south side. We cut the ribbon under a pale gray sky while snow fell in light flurries. I looked at the families waiting to move in, their smiles soft and uncertain, and felt something inside me settle at last. After the ceremony, Caleb joined me as I walked the perimeter of the site. "I think Grandpa would have liked this one," he said quietly. I smiled. He would have asked if we measured twice before we poured the foundation. Caleb laughed, the sound carrying across the cold air. "I checked it 3 times, he said. For once I believed him. That evening, as twilight spread over the city, I stood by the window in my office watching the lights come on across the skyline. The reflection in the glass showed the framed letter Samuel had written, the one that had started all of this. I read it again, tracing the familiar words, Never doubt who you are. I realized then that he hadn't just meant the company or our name. He meant something simpler, stronger, that legacy isn't what we inherit. It's what we choose to protect. When the clock struck 7, I shut off the lights and stepped into the quiet hallway. The building was still save for the faint hum of the elevators and the soft echo of footsteps from the cleaning crew below. I paused by the front doors, hand resting on the cool brass handle, and took one last look back at the logo etched into the glass Morgan & Sons builders. It wasn't just a name anymore. It was a promise. As I walked outside, the city greeted me with cold air and the smell of fresh snow. The streets shimmered under the glow of streetlights, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. I pulled my coat tighter and started toward the car, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a long fight finally settling into peace. There was still one more thing left to do, something that would close this chapter for good. And when the morning came, I'd be ready to face it. The next morning, I drove out to the edge of the city where the air smelled of wet earth and cedar. The small cemetery sat on a gentle hill tucked behind a row of maples that were already shedding their leaves. I carried a single white rose in one hand and the old blueprint folder in the other, the one that had survived every move, every storm, every moment. I'd almost given up. The morning light was soft, the kind that settles rather than shines. Samuel's headstone stood near the corner, simple and unadorned. Just his name, the years and the words, build what lasts. I knelt beside it, brushing away a few fallen leaves. For the first time, there was no ache sharp enough to steal my breath, just a calm that felt like peace, finding its way home. I laid the rose down, then opened the folder. Inside were the original sketches of our first project together, edges worn, pencil lines smudged, but still visible. I traced the lines with my fingertips, remembering his steady hand guiding mine, the smell of sawdust on his flannel, the way he'd say, "Good work always tells the truth." I told him everything then about the company, the investigation, my mother's garden, and Caleb working side by side with the crews. I told him the truth had found its place, and so had I. The wind moved through the trees, carrying a faint sound that reminded me of his quiet laugh, the one he saved for small victories. When I stood to leave, I whispered, "It's done, Grandpa. You can rest now." Back in the city, life moved with a rhythm that finally made sense. The Morgan Foundation's first apprenticeship group was halfway through their training, and their projects were already taking shape in neighborhoods that had once been forgotten. Every Friday, I walked through the workshop where they learned to weld and frame and pour, watching them trade jokes while their hands worked with the same focus Samuel used to have. They were building more than structures. They were building the next chapter of what he started. Caleb was thriving in his own way, too. He no longer talked about money or titles, just blueprints, budgets, and deadlines. He still made mistakes, but now he owned them and learned fast. One evening, after everyone had left, I found him sitting in the break room with a mug of coffee and a stack of reports. He looked up and said, "I think I finally get what Grandpa meant about honor." I smiled. "It's not a word you wear. It's a weight you carry." He nodded, slowly, understanding in his eyes. My mother visited the office often, always bringing something from her garden, fresh herbs, a handful of flowers, or just the quiet warmth she had found again. She said being here felt like standing in sunlight after years of shade. Sometimes she'd pause in the lobby, look around at the photos of Samuel's early days, and whisper, "He'd be proud of you." Each time I'd tell her the same thing, he'd be proud of all of us. Months passed like pages, turning steady and sure. The company flourished not because of luck, but because every person who walked through those doors knew exactly what it stood for. Integrity wasn't just a word on the wall anymore, it was the blueprint for everything we built. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the skyline, I stood by the window of my office watching the reflection of the city stretch across the river. The light caught the framed letter Samuel had written, the one that changed everything. "Never doubt who you are." The paper had yellowed slightly, but the ink was still bold, unwavering. I read it again, the words settling deeper each time. That night, I finally understood what this journey had been about. It wasn't only about restoring a company or clearing a name, it was about remembering that the truest legacies aren't built from wealth or inheritance. They're built from choices, honest, difficult, human choices. Samuel had given me the foundation, but I had learned how to build the walls myself. As the last light faded, I turned off the office lamp and stepped outside. The air was cool, and the streets shimmered with that quiet golden glow that comes just before night fully arrives. I walked past the building's front doors, running my hand lightly over the carved stone that read Morgan & Sons Builders. The name no longer felt like a weight I had to carry, it felt like a promise I'd kept. At the curb, I paused to take in the view of the city, its rooftops, cranes, and bridges stretching toward the horizon. The world Samuel helped shape was still standing stronger than ever. I smiled, knowing that somewhere he'd be smiling too. Before I drove away, I thought about everything this fight had cost and everything it had restored: dignity, truth, and peace. Some battles aren't won with anger or power. They're won with quiet persistence, with the choice to stay decent, even when it's hard. That's what lasts. And if you've ever had to rebuild something, your name, your peace, your sense of worth, I hope this story reminds you that no one can take from you what's rooted in truth. Thank you for listening. If this story spoke to you, share it with someone who needs a little strength today, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about resilience, redemption, and finding your way home.